What's he building in there? What's he building in there? We have a right to know.
All right, welcome everyone to episode 14 of Reframing the Narrative. The name of this episode is The Beast System Always Takes, and it's inspired by a true life story. But before we jump into that, Jake, good to see you as always.
Good to see you, PJ, as well. Good to be back. We're ready to rock. Like
Absolutely.
posers.
So, I'll just open with some initial comments, and we'll just kind of take it from there as we always do. But this episode is inspired by a loved one who recently passed, and I was reflecting recently on everything that happened around that, and this person suffered from a pretty deep depression that was in part due to his inability to find a certain status of position that he felt he was entitled to, and just had a lot of struggles trying to get into the beast system in the corporate world. And it just really made me think about how much we give to that system in our time, and that time that we use giving to that always invariably takes, how many things could we be doing differently, or building our own thing, or creating in some way that's different from this prescribed formula in the corporate world or in the beast system in general. And just really was something I wanted to bring to the table for this episode to talk about and share with our listeners, and hopefully get some comments and their thoughts on that too. But really just the bottom line was, in this case, the loved one just gave so much of his mental energy and time and thoughts and doubts to that system, and it kept pulling and pulling and pulling until it ultimately took his life. And just something for all of us to reflect on, that there's never a point where it won't take. It'll take as much as you give it. And it's always a balance in life. I mean, obviously there's no way to fully circumvent this system, but we can choose how much of our time to pay attention to it, and to how much to give to it to sustain our lives. And I know, Jake, you had a recent example of that this week. Even just trying to get this week's episode recorded was a challenge because of that. But that's my opening preamble. Jake, love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Well, first of all, my condolences on the family loss there. It's really tough. And another thing that's just really tough is when you know somebody's struggling and they have a lot of potential and they just can't make it. It's a loss, not just of a life, a precious life, but that potential and everything that they represented in that life that could have been. So it's extra sad to hear that loss. I think that this episode ties into a bunch of other themes that we've raised in our podcast up to this point, and those being essentially the karmic situation, the karmic setup and arrangement of so many different things in our world, as well as essentially having to choose at some point whether you're going to opt in or not. And I think something that you just raised was kind of, well, this is the system we have, but we can choose to which degree we want to play along with. And for the time being, at least, we're not in an all-encompassing system, and we can kind of figure out ways to build something that's parallel to it or apart from the current system. At this point, I do feel like the walls are closing in on us at the moment. But not to fearmonger on that. There's always opportunity. And I think one thing we learned from the scamdemic since 2020 was that there should always be some kind of an option not to go along with it. It could be painful, and you might not make the jump to warp speed, as I think of it sometimes. But at least you have your soul intact if you do that, and you do choose to opt out. It's never going to be easy. Remember what Biden said when he was up in that completely, well, it was Hitlerian really, but I think it was meant to be satanic, that the red lights with all the black robes and it was like 1933 Berlin, and it was, I don't know, I haven't had a peek in Satan's lair, but it would certainly look something like that if we had the opportunity. And Biden was saying, we're running out of patience with you people who haven't gotten the magic formula in your arms. I always dance around that term. I know we could probably just say it, but it's just kind of fun. So you haven't gotten the magic potion, you haven't gotten the arm darts, and it's going to be a dark winter. And he was threatening to make life difficult. And I think at one point they even mentioned that, we'll just make everything really difficult, and most of the people will cry uncle, and they just need a certain, I won't say put it on them, a certain percentage or degree of compliance is necessary for any of these things to go forward and to operate. And we've touched that on our money show as well. What is money? What is currency? We all go around pretending that these ones and zeros that they enter into ledgers these days, let alone the cotton that we call paper money, that we pretend that's money. It's based on nothing. It's just based on the trust that somebody's going to honor that thing, which is actually a debt note. So essentially, I think my point is that we do live under a system, and we're surrounded in this system where we have many opportunities to either go along with the system or we need to find alternatives. And when we do find alternatives, it's not as convenient. When you ask to opt out at the airport, you're going to get patted down, and some perv who is selected for that job, probably because they're willing to make people feel uncomfortable and do creepy things, is going to reach between your legs and feel up your crotch. And they'll probably take their sweet time before they get to you anyway, and they'll make it very uncomfortable. But you still get through security at some point. Same thing with all the other forms of convenience that are going through. It's convenient just to hold out your cell phone and check out. Or even at Whole Foods, they're using your palm print. And so literally this beast system is in the sense that there's no buying and selling without this thing. It's almost completely in place, but there are ways to opt out of it. One thing I've thought long and hard of, and you have to pick your battles, but sometimes when I see a sign that says this business does not take cash, I would, if I had like I said, if I could pick the right battle, I think sometimes it's legally required of any business to take cash. And I think businesses need to be called out on it before it's too late. So maybe there's some kind of movement that we need, us or listeners or just people that are kind of awake in general, they need to just call people out and say, no, you can't get away with saying we do not accept cash, because legally you have to. So we are in a system and at a point where there are overwhelming trends for what we're given, but we are not out of choices. I think that's my main takeaway at this point. And so if it rises up to the point where you're aware of it, then take massive action. We need to activate. So this is something that's a good example of going back to our episode with Michael Jaguar. Activate. maybe call someone out. And maybe you're not going to actually lodge a complaint, but you can remind somebody that has a sign up at a coffee shop says we don't take cash to say, sorry, you know, by the way, I'm going to pay with my card this time, but under law, you are obligated to take cash, and you should do something about that before other people complain too. Back to you.
Amen to that. And I'll start with my comment on the backside of what you just said there, and then move backwards. But just to maybe bring up something from the past, and I'm not sure if it's still a thing since maybe 2020 or 2021, but I know that there was a movement for a while. I think it was started by Catherine Austin Fitz and co-opted by James Corbett, but they had a movement there for a while called Cash Fridays, and it was, you know, a direct movement from people, you know, in the quote unquote freedom movement to only pay cash in every transaction on a Friday. And don't know if that's still a thing, but definitely something I think we could all restart and, as you say, make it more of a regular practice to just force businesses to take cash in and push back when they try to go the electronic route. I certainly, you know, even in a small way, anytime that I'm dining out and a QR code is shoved in my face, I ask for a physical menu just on principle, and I'll make them go to the back and have a discussion about it, even if they weren't prepared. I mean, I think people just need to realize that people still want, you know, the physical menu, and we're not okay with the QR version of the beast system. So, yeah, just something, you know, small little bits of resistance, death by 1,000 cuts can eventually, you know, bring the giant down. So we all have to stand in our power. And to that respect, kind of going to one of your other comments about opportunity, you know, even in my own situation, having suffered from the downturn in the economy, it just really reminded me that with change comes opportunity. And there's so many things that I've discovered that I could be doing with my time to not only earn, but to build and do different things. And one of the results of that is actually this podcast, which would have never happened had I not had, you know, my life change and, you know, starting to create videos, which, by the way, I'll just tell our listeners that I've got something cooking in the background for the Central Texas Rabbit Hole on one of our favorite subjects about virology or virology, however you want to say that. Tip of the hat to Mike Stone there. But, you know, trying to, you know, break down some of the common myths in easy, digestible ways. But all that is an aside, that there are a lot of things that I've thought of that I could do to sustain myself without being dependent on the mother may I corporate system that I haven't even, you know, made time to do yet. Like there's so much that we can all be doing and creating. You know, we don't have to be locked into a traditional system to sustain our lives and sustain our families and, you know, keep a roof over our head. And sometimes we all fall victim into that trap that there's only one way to do this, but there's so many ways. And, you know, we all have been given talents and gifts and a great mind and creativity, and we can use that. It's just a choice of whether you want to make that bold step and use your creative abilities, or whether you want to be a slave to wage slavery. And that's really a personal choice. But to me, all this has been super enlightening. And, you know, I had hoped to impart that on some level to the loved one in question, but perhaps it was too late in that case. But just, I think it's good for all of us to remember that there's always ways to work. There's always ways to contribute. There's always ways to build and grow. And we're only limited by our mind. To steal a quote from one of the people that I follow, that is JT follows JC. He said it more than once: if you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. And so, yeah, that's just my comment to a lot of what you said, that, you know, the only limit is in our mind in terms of what we do with the time we have.
I love that quote from, I've heard it before, so it might not come from JT himself, but either way, credit to him for a really nice channel and the work he's doing as well. And and it's a very quotable quote and something to live by as well. And to quote someone else, probably very much a role player in the beast system, but Bono in one of the U2's lyrics said, you got stuck in a moment you can't get out of. So we need to remind ourselves when we're in really bad moments, there is always some kind of an opportunity in hand when things look really bad. And we need to practice getting out of little situations even, so that when a big situation comes up that could be a life or death kind of decision, we need to make the right decision and choose life, so we don't snuff out our own potential as well, and also bring sorrow to a lot of people, because even Bill Gates' mom loves him. One thing that you mentioned, just in general, about kind of like working for the man and the beast system and all that, is the question of why. And I think we often get stuck in the idea that we need this and we need that, and therefore we need a certain level of salary and we need this sort of lifestyle. And so if that is limiting your choices of what to do with your skills and your time especially, then, and if that's a problem for you, maybe it's not a problem. There's plenty of people they're just going along. They're working for the man and they're okay. They've got the cubicle life and they're happy because maybe their significant other and their family also rewards that. They're like, dad's a good bread earner, mom's a good whatever office worker. They're bringing home the and the tofuti, and everything's going well because that's their level of expectation, and they don't value freedom. And I think that's probably pretty common. But for those of us, again, once the awareness raises to a certain level and you reflect on where you are, maybe you're pursuing something that doesn't really make you happy or you really don't need, and you could use less and therefore maybe, and I'm not saying you positions or trades or pursuits that allow more freedom necessarily pay less or less financially rewarding. But if that is the case, then maybe it's a kind of a trade-off that is you're going to get ahead in the end. And you might just have to drive that car for a few more years and make good friends with a good mechanic that you can trust, because those are always good to know anyway. All sorts of things like that. Sometimes we're stuck with a certain amount of debt and we got to pay it off. But wherever you can make a decision, choose freedom over enslavement, then, like I said, there's opportunities abounding all over. But so that whole beast system, working for the man, I'm in a no, kind of like a dead end job. That notion I've been mulling over that recently and just wondering, like, why do people settle for that? Is that all there is? And then, of course, we know that once you get out of that system in the 9 to 5, the daily grind of working for it, the system is set up to drain the so-called wealth in other ways shortly after your retirement age. Because if you're on pharma and you're a typical, I think it's over 55, like 65% of Americans, if we have an international audience, I'm sorry, the reference is only for us U.S. Americans, but I think it's like 68% of Americans over the age of 55 are on some kind of prescription drugs. And that's something you just don't turn back from. So that's another juncture at which you should, or you could potentially stop and reflect. Do I want to really start taking these statins, or should I look at my diet and lifestyle? Because statins are actually never going to help you, but that's not really the point in the discussion. It's just when we get to a certain point, we end up getting on these pharmaceuticals, and we're seeing the doctors that basically just offer us a slow demise, and we often never really crawl out of that hole that we build or dig for ourselves by going along with the system. So the medical model, the income tax, and the fiat currency, it's all part of the same thing. Thank you, Rockefellers.
Absolutely. Boy, I couldn't agree more to that. And, most people probably, well, I'd say outside of our small community, most people probably don't realize that, pharmaceuticals, that word is derived from the Latin pharmakia, and, that's specifically forbidden in scripture. And it basically is equal to or to parallel to witchcraft. And if you look at the early origins of the people who practiced alchemy that led to ultimately the foundation of the pharmaceutical industry, they were very aware what they were doing, and they believed in a lot of strange, dark things, including human sacrifice and animal sacrifice. And it's a really dark rabbit hole to go down, but the point of the matter is, I think you characterized that perfectly, that they offer a slow death for people who want a temporary convenience. And again, just a great example of the beast system taking as much as you give it, right? Like the more you're on those, the quicker they speed your demise. And that's a personal choice. And I understand there's some conditions which may not be avoidable, although I would also question whether there's natural remedies to a lot of things. I don't think this world was created for us in a way that we had to develop pharmaceuticals to survive or to live a wholesome life. But that's another aside. But I totally agreed with you that that's just one of the many ways that the system will draw from you and take out every last bit of life from you until the very end. So really good point there. And, I think just something we've touched on before is, and it's very related to this subject, is the idea of time, right? Like I saw a great video recently that really got me thinking further in the direction that I have about, I brought this up earlier, wage slavery, that you never really get truly compensated for the time you put into any given job. And, just thinking about that, revisiting the idea of paying your attention and where you're spending your time. Like, is it something that you really believe in, whatever it is that you're doing? Do you think it's doing something for humanity in some way? Are you helping people, or are you simply just making other people rich and trading the few hours that you've got in your life for the illusion of money?
Yeah, I've reflected on that a lot. I also feel like a lot of the time there's the highest paying jobs are kind of propped up for a while, and you can see them kind of percolating up through the whole education system. They start training people in a certain field, like biotech, for instance, is a big one. And then there's just AI and the developers. The last few years, living where I live, I'm surrounded by people who have very high paying jobs driving their Teslas, maybe not so many these days. But they're living life high in the hog. Is that the word, the term? And they were programming and being highly rewarded to build something that will make them supernumerary, in other words, obsolete, and will replace them. And they made that choice. And I think I raised that point to some developers. I'm like, aren't you just building your replacement? Because how hard is it to code? And the AI will learn at some point how to code, and it will be able to check its errors, and it can run like 6,000 test websites and A/B test the marketing, whatever it needs to do. And it can just run the error reports and correct them. And and you're going to be out of a job, bro. So the whole, I mean, it's even made the term learn to code, bro, obsolete, you know? And it dawned on me the other day going on, I actually, in a conversation the other day, I found myself saying something that was really contradictory, and I'd like to get to the bottom of it because it was just odd to hear myself say it. But I essentially said, yeah, if I won the lottery, or if I had a lot of financial flexibility, a lot of money, then I could get off the grid. I mean, what was I thinking? So in my mind, I'm stuck in this system where I need my Wi-Fi and I need my smartphone for work. I literally need Slack for work, so I need a smartphone. And I'm thinking, if I'm going to go back and live like a homesteader, like Little House on the Prairie, I need a lot of money. Why would that make sense? You know, shouldn't I be able to just simplify everything? And I'm still trying to find the motivation for what I found and heard coming out of my mouth when I said that. But in my mind, it's actually kind of an investment, right? You're trying to get out of the system, and the system is so overwhelmingly compelling and coercive that you have to take extra steps to get away from it, in much in the same sense that you pay extra for organic, and you have to go out of your way to find grass and soil that is untainted to put your feet on so that you can ground, which used to just be called walking. You know, just going outside with bare feet. You were able to do that, but now you got to look for like hypodermic needles and glass and, you know, doggy do and all that kind of stuff. But we used to just call it walking. It's just like organic food used to just be known as food. And we're paying extra. We're going out of our way to read labels and make sure that our food provisions are untainted, which is really hard to do. As I sit out here under a chemtrail sky, it's just hard to avoid. But we got to do our best, you know, at every point. Because I think karmically, getting back to that, it all adds up.
Couldn't agree more with that. And, you know, you touched on a point there that I should have brought up earlier, and it's been another lesson for me in my transition to creating and doing in different ways than I have before. And that is really just, to borrow the title of a recent episode, just taking inventory about what you really need. And, you know, I've realized that there's so much stuff that I spent money on that I just simply don't need, and things that I thought I really needed that I wanted to spend on. And it's like, I have everything I need. And, you know, using my time or fretting over the ability to buy a bunch of stuff that ultimately will just sit there. Like, how much stuff do you buy that you actually use on a daily basis? I mean, really, how much do you actually need? And, you know, I understand there's many, especially in our current economy, who have different situations and have more immediate pressing needs. But I think a lot of us, if we took a step back and said, you know, what do we really need to live in, and what are shiny quarters that we're chasing after that really ultimately won't add anything to our lives or enrich us in some way. And, you know, months or years down the line will virtually be forgotten or untouched. You know, how many of those things? And, you know, I had to chuckle when you brought up Teslas, because that was all the rage, and, you know, tech bros and people of that ilk. And it's like, now their hero is their enemy, and they're having a lot of second thoughts about that. And well, I guess that's what you get for following the trend. I can't remember who it was I think it was Mark Twain who said, if you ever find yourself in the majority, it's time to reflect, or something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but it's time for some introspection, if that's a word, you know. So anyway, yeah, I think it's a good lesson from, you know, our down economy and people in their different jobs or transitions or whatever. It's like, really give deep thought to what you really need to be happy. And is money and things what's going to make you happy? I tend to doubt that.
Yeah, and in addition to the time that you spend, if you have no energy left over as well to do anything that does bring you some kind of creative satisfaction or maybe help some other people, then maybe that's worth reflecting on as well and evaluating. I find myself a lot of times at the end of the day just kind of exhausted and really tempted to just kind of veg out because my body and my mind can't really take any more. So that's got me questioning every once in a while, though in general, I am very grateful for how I'm able to make some of the fiat currency because it doesn't involve being in a cubicle in a soulless position and dealing with office politics. Yeah, so, but it does limit me at the same time in the energy I have to expend on other things, and such as maybe making videos or maybe just helping other people, which I would love to do. I'd love to do more volunteering and some things. I think there's always, once that light bulb goes off and you realize that that's how you're rationing your energy, maybe that's just the beginning of, okay, well, do something about it. So light bulb has gone off for me and I just need to ration my energy a little better, perhaps. And no PG&E, that's not what I'm talking about. That's the energy company in California, for those of you not in California. Yuck. Monopoly, actually.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point as well. In the beast system is, they've found a way to monetize energy, and I truly believe that in the quote unquote old world or the world before the industrial age, if you want to call it that, or our current little season, as I tend to believe that, I think there was such a thing as free energy and free energy use. And actually, credit to Madeline from Leaving Babylon. She's done some great work recently looking back at some very old photos and books that sort of detail how people lived back then and used energy. And specifically, one thing that I think is really cool to imagine, probably not that far off in our past, was the common use of dirigibles or zeppelins or whatever you would want to call those. It's quite interesting. You can look back in very old books and see pictures, and she's shown that in some of her recent series, Sides of the North, which is great, by the way. I highly recommend it. But she's shown.
What's the title?
Sides of the North. She's got a recent series. I think she's on part 4 right now, of kind of looking at how everything points towards what we call typically the quote unquote North Pole, and what really is probably there and why we're blocked from that, and just a lot of the history pointing to that direction. But anyway, part of that exploration, she shows some of those old pictures of people flying around in their dirigibles and zeppelins, and there were all different forms of them, and they would dock on high towers. She recently speculated that perhaps lighthouses were a place for getting on and getting off and perhaps refueling. However, they were using the ether, which is another thing that's kind of lost in the annals of history in dusty shelves, that there is this source of energy called ether that up until Einstein's fraudulent and overly complex mathematical equations was a pretty well accepted concept, that there was this force that surrounded us called the ether. And I think there's good evidence to believe that really there was energy that everyone was able to tap into, and you can even look at some of those photos from old world's fairs at night where they're lit up as almost as bright as day, and no evidence of wiring or anything like that. Like they were definitely harnessing some sort of natural energy. And that's all to say that part of us living is just paying for energy and housing, where I think there was a point where a lot of that paying to live was not necessary, and we really did have the freedom to live a more balanced and natural and holistic life than we do now. And it's just something to reflect on. But I do like the idea of, everyone had their dirigible and they could just fly to wherever they wanted to go. How cool is that? No ticket on Southwest. You just got in your dirigible and went off and docked at whatever tall tower or whatever that infrastructure was. But there's plenty of evidence in old books that that's how people used to live, and that's pretty cool to think about.
Well, I didn't know that. So were there actually individual sized dirigibles?
Yeah, Madeline showed some pictures that people had their own. That was like their little surfboard,
Family
almost.
station wagons?
Yeah, so they had their own little dirigibles and they were flying around, but then you could get in the big passenger ones, and there were even like what we would call today aircraft carriers, and basically big dirigible carrying airships. And yeah, just a fascinating world to imagine of what was before the big takeover and Rockefeller medicine and Rockefeller everything.
Before the last reset. Yeah.
Exactly.
That was a major reset. And how big of a coincidence was it that one of the most horrific films that's still available, including the soundtrack, is of the explosion and disintegration and crash of the Hindenburg in full view of everybody there, including the news footage and the announcer going, "Oh, the horror," and just literally seeing people shoad, which means burnt offering, burnt alive. And then, we don't want that technology anymore, of course, right? That's too dangerous. So it was one way to get rid of that easily. They had their Zapruder film for that. And speaking of free energy, this is something that just flabbergasted, just totally floored me recently. If you're familiar with the researcher Veda Austin out of New Zealand, she's done a lot of research that follows up on the work of the Japanese researcher whose name always escapes me, and sorry, I should know better. But him and also Gerald Pollack and some others about the nature of water and how it can hold information, transmit information, and even almost hold feelings and emotions as well and transmit those. And she has done a lot of experiments where she gives prompts to water in a petri dish, and whether she gives vocal cues or puts a photograph underneath the dish or shows the dish a picture, or sometimes she'll even place an object next to it. Like she placed a guitar next to a petri dish, and it's unbelievable. It came up with 3 different, basically like macro images of like the bridge and the strings, and then a little further away with the middle part of the guitar and the whole. And one thing she did was prompt it, I think it was with her voice, she said, "free energy." And the pattern that developed in the water, because if you're thinking of water, has always been here since the beginning of time. So it has this primitive memory or an all-encompassing memory. The water came up with a pattern that reminded me kind of church spires and the, I'd say almost like diamond shape patterns that radiated away from it. So everything was kind of a diamond pattern going away from a point. And that just blew me away. So I think those of us that are suspecting that free energy was certainly readily available and that it could be again in the future, that's certainly something to point to. That sort of technology and those structures that still remain or that we could see in photographs. And water does remember that, it seems. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, wasn't it Tesla who said something to the effect of, if you want to understand the keys to life better, think energy and sound and frequency, or something related to, I'm roughly paraphrasing, but I absolutely think that, besides the ether and, water somehow relating to all of that. Like there's so much of this world that we could tap into that we just simply have lost our collective memory of how to do that. And, even just taking a step way further and for many off the deep end, and that's fine because that's who I am. I created the rabbit hole, so that's what I do. But there are some stories of potentially the millennial reign that one particular researcher had dug up, and it sounds like some of these perhaps could live in the Vatican's library, and maybe some are under lock and key. But anyway, this particular researcher started finding these stories, which have been called hagiography, and there's a great episode on Understanding Conspiracy about this. And essentially, they're stories about the saints and what the saints did during that reign, and some of the things that were possible in their glorified bodies. And one thing that this particular researcher had noted was that there were a lot of stories of saints who would fly. And I even wonder if that's like something that, if we were really in touch with the world that was created for us, if we could somehow fly. I don't know. It's just something to think about, just like thinking about the world of people and their individual dirigibles. Just how much more powerful and creative could we be as humans that has just been suppressed from us? And, we've been distracted by whatever's on the boob tube, or, chasing after, illusionary money and all of that in the rat race. Like, how much other of the world could we be experiencing that we're not? And certainly water tells that story. And I have to confess, I can't remember that Japanese researcher who, his name either, who did that foundational work. But for our viewers who may be interested, it's a pretty quick search on, YouTube or one of the other platforms to look up water and emotion. I'm not sure what the exact keywords are, but it's not hard to find.
Masaru Emoto was his name.
Thank you very much.
Masaru
Emoto. So there's a bunch of videos out there about him, just really excellent work that he did. And I know that others, as you said, have picked up the baton and carried it forward. And it really is interesting. I mean, you can play, I think some of the older videos that Emoto did was like playing heavy metal and looking at water versus classical, or, saying things like I hate you versus I love you, and, very different patterns. And even to that extent, like I've seen videos where, certain sounds create patterns in sand, and that has a not the same type of memory as water, but it definitely, through sound, you can influence patterns in, dirt or sand or whatever. And I think just the world we live in is so energetic, and, it's quite possible that we live in a big toroid, and that's part of real Earth that we've talked about before. But how all that fits together is really anyone's best guess. I don't know that there's a way that we'll ever know that for sure, but definitely, something interesting to look into for our listeners who haven't, or just to reflect on and learn a little bit more about.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that is clear is that whether it's the monetary system, pharmaceuticals, entertainment, or just all the different signals in the atmosphere, it just takes us away from what is true and genuine. And I think what is afoot could be an effort really to just get us out of touch with that, the true nature, like you mentioned, that for starting with the true earth, but also, of course, continuing extending to our true selves and what our real purpose is, which is not to sit in a cubicle. I think even people that sit in cubicles could probably agree, right? My true purpose is not to just sit in a cubicle and put up with a lot of shite all day from coworkers and bosses and all that stuff, and the commute, and it's got to be something beyond what we're given. And there is a tendency to fall into the entrapment that everything, all these trappings deliver to us. But as I've been stressing, I think there's usually an alternative, and it might not be trendy. It might not be as fun, but if it's truer and more authentic, in the end, if you stick with it, it'll probably pay off. And I was just reflecting today about just the whole idea of critical mass, and a lot of these changes that we could use to implement in our world could start with people just saying no, but it's just so difficult. It's like just giving the example of opting out at the airport. When you're running late for a flight because you got stuck in traffic, are you going to say, I'd like to opt out? You might not. And then because you went for that Michael Chertoff naked body scanner, underwear bomber, false flag machine, next time you'll probably just be, I've been through it. No big deal. I'm still alive. I didn't get cancer. So I'm going to go through it again. But somebody on a podcast I was listening to recently was talking about how like this whole gaggle of people that was leaving Acapulco in Acapulco basically was opting out and causing much havoc for the security people at the airport. And I couldn't help but think to myself, how many of those people opted out because they had safety in numbers? And they might not always be they might be self-styled freedom advocates, but when push comes to shove, what you do in the dark, it really defines you. And I'm not really calling them out. I'm just wondering, does everybody opt out every single time that they're in a situation like that at the airport? And if I were to look in the mirror, hello mirror, I will admit it. I don't opt out every single time. When it's easy enough to do it and I have plenty of time, I do opt out. But maybe having reached that point of self-reflection and calling other people possibly out, I'm calling myself out here. So I'm going to opt out every single time. Since I do have the opportunity, it's my right, but it could just take people saying, what if everybody that went to the airport on a single day, just like Cash Fridays, they all said, we're all opting out today. No harm's going to come to them. It's going to be a little longer wait, but TSA is going to be overwhelmed and they're going to have to say, well, okay, maybe we'll just use metal detectors now instead of the naked body scanners. And it would be so easy. But it just takes that consciousness. And I think we are, those of us with this kind of consciousness, we are in a distinct minority because all it takes is going to comment sections about whatever, armed darts or things like that, or, just do measles recently and on YouTube, and you can see where the mainstream opinion is. And it can be a little disheartening, but it doesn't have to be.
Totally agreed. And I recall a story somewhere between, let's say, 2020 and 2022. I don't remember exactly when this happened, but there was a day declared like anti-TSA screening or something like that. And there was a big movement around, causing all of the TSA people to have to pat down everyone that came through. And my recollection of that story was they basically just stood aside and let everyone go through. Like, because everyone had resisted, then they're just like, well, we can't they're overwhelming us, right? We can't deal with all these people who are saying no. And that really does just demonstrate the power that we each have to say no. I've already told the story in a past episode about how, during the coercion to get people to take the armed darts in 2021, I said no to my employer at the time, and it was hard. And at the time, it didn't seem like they'd ever relent, that you'd be able to get a job without it. And I said, well, to hell with it. My job is not worth this. Like, I will take my bodily autonomy and figure something else out. And it actually, at that time, started me initially down a path that now I'm pursuing fully, because that was a way around it. And, it was just a demonstration that there's many ways to circumvent the system. Going back to the beginning of this podcast, there's always a way to say no and do something different and create or grow in a different way. And we all have that power, and it just as you said, like we discussed with Michael Jaguar, we can activate and reclaim our power and stand in our power, and the potential is limitless, and the only limits are in our mind.
Perfectly said. Maybe by way of wrapping up, we could give ourselves the little subheading for this episode: the power of no. What do you think?
I love it. That's great. Yes, the power of no is, and it's just something that we all have to remind ourselves in, because there are so many traps, as you say, out there, and so many ways to get sucked back in and feel powerless. But we do, every single one of us, have the power to say no, to create, to do, to grow. It's all there.
Amen, brother.
Well, I suppose with that, as you say, this does feel like a natural stopping point. I think it's been a great discussion, and I'll just tell our viewers that next week we do have a guest lined up, and we'll be talking a little bit about the world around us and what's been happening recently, and stay tuned for that. And I'm just going to give another shout out if anyone wants to join. This particular gentleman is someone I know in real life who just said, hey, how we talked about doing this, let's do it. There's a number of ways you can get in touch with us, either through the Reframing the Narrative channel links or through the Central Texas Rabbit Hole. We have our communication options there, but definitely reach out, and we'd love to hear from you, or leave a comment, leave a big thumbs up. We always like those, and we'll see you next week.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage. You just have to raise enough questions, spread enough dirt, plant enough conspiracy theorizing that citizens no longer know what to believe.